Hello and welcome to Spin Nation. We're the podcast that slices through the noise to reveal the forces shaping Canadians' perspectives. I am your host, Laurel, and I'm here as always with my co-host, Emmanuel.
Good morning, Laurel.
So now we are trying to record today, but if you hear buzzsaws in the background, that's because they are cutting down, unfortunately, a beautiful, huge tree in our neighbor's yard. So if you start hearing that melodic sounds of buzzsaws, that's what's happening. But we're hoping to get this done before they begin.
Always a little sad to see those trees go, but understand that it's the road to progress.
I'm a little bummed about it. So we have a number of the week that we want to introduce. Should we call it Le Chiffre?
Le chiffre du jour, or the number of the week.
So it comes a little bit like that James Bond evil guy, though. He wasn't there one called Le Chiffre?
Le chiffre, that's right. Well, the number of the day is 4-1, and that's the number of pieces of coverage on media or social media that Pierre Poilievre is getting versus the number of hits that his opponent, independent Bonnie Critchley, is getting.
And this is in the upcoming Battle River-Crowfoot by-election. Normally, by-elections are pretty sleepy, uninteresting procedures, I would even call them, but not this time.
Indeed, it's a very different conversation because it follows the loss of Poilievre's seat in Ottawa, and therefore a number of challenges for him, as he cannot be the leader of the Conservative Party until he is a sitting member. So there's been a lot of eyeballs on that situation because this is not just a local story, but a national story.
But even more so, I think people expected him to sashay into this seat without having to do very much work. It's historically a very staunch conservative riding.
83%. That's that was the vote count for the previous holder of that seat who gave it up.
But this time he's got two headwinds, let's say, and even if he wins, there's an implication that if he doesn't win with a landslide, what does that mean for him as a conservative leader? And he's facing a leadership review, I think in January is when they said. So this is more than just winning a seat in the House for him. It's an additional, like, lick your finger, put it in the air about what do people think about Poilievre as a potential leader for the party and prime minister as well.
And I think he faces two different challenges in this race. The first one is any candidate being parachuted into a riding where, they have not spent time in the past, especially a very rural riding where, I'm not going to say everybody knows each other, but certainly a strong knowledge of the who's who of the area. So that's challenge number one. Challenge number two is dealing with that wave of separatist Alberta and being caught in between to some degree. So that pull between a federalist effort and an anti-federalist movement.
And just to layer it all on, another element that he is facing is this longest ballot committee who is targeting this particular by-election. So let's get into our business question of the week. Do people think Poilievre could lose this by-election? So it doesn't necessarily mean will he, but are there perception that he could lose, which I think is what matters to him in terms of his longer term sustainability as the leader of the Conservative Party, which is ultimately the game that he needs to play. Now, let's start with Polymarket. For those of you who are not familiar with Polymarket, it's an online betting platform, but it has been fairly accurate in previous elections at predicting the outcomes.
I'd question if it's always accurate. It can go either way. It was probably effective in predicting the election of Donald Trump. It was kind of so-so on the Canadian election. So it's got hits and it's got misses. But it's an interesting indicator because people are betting money.
Now, they have him at 97% chance of winning. So that's very high.
Incredibly high, though I'll note that this has gone down a little bit. It was in the even higher 90s, 98, 98 and a half, and it's gone down to 97, maybe 96.5, depending on exactly what
I don't
day
think
you're
that's
looking.
fair. I mean, it was down in the 80s. I was looking at that back in June. So it has gone up. Yesterday it was at 96. Today it's at 97. I mean, it's a very strong vote of confidence into Poilievre on Polymarket. But that's Polymarket. You can also game those systems because people know that they look at it. So if you get enough people to bet on Poilievre, then you're going to skew the results.
I'd also be curious to fully understand if there's any bias on Polymarket, simply because you need to use crypto to make your bets.
It's not representative of a diverse viewpoints of Canadians, but it's a data point that anybody can go and take a look at.
It's a data point.
So there's two big headwinds he's facing. Let's talk a bit more about the longest ballot committee before we look at Bonnie and the campaign that she's running. So for those of you who don't know what the longest ballot committee is, what they've done is they've had, last and I looked yesterday, 32 names that they have added to the ballot. And Poilievre is really mad about this. He's asked Elections Canada to step in, change the rules so that this can't happen. But it's 3 people who are just getting a bunch of people to register as candidates in that riding, even though they aren't really running, just to confuse the process so that when voters go in, instead of being the usual 5 to 7 candidates, there's going to be about 140 different candidates.
And if I remember correctly, this happened in the previous or in the full election, right? For his riding in particular. So this has been following him for a couple of occasions now.
Now, they say they are not specifically targeting Poilievre because they're anti-Poilievre or anti-conservative. They're just picking very high-profile elections in Carleton, Ottawa Carleton during the major election. And now, of course, this is the only big one that's running. But they said that it reinforces their conviction that politicians are not well suited to decide the rules of their own elections. They think the democracy should be designed to serve voters, not short-term political interests of those in power. So essentially, this is their protest or form of protest. They don't think politicians should be the one deciding how elections and the rules for elections should be done because they're going to do so in a self-serving interest, which is kind of true. What is your view, Emmanuel, on this longest ballot committee?
Well, it's I guess it's a protest. I'm not entirely clear the cause of an effect, except just making it very tedious for all of the voters. I can't say I'm personally in support of this mode of protest, so maybe there's better ways to express their views. But certainly, one thing that it's doing very effectively is getting attention.
Right, and so we looked at what Canadians are saying about the longest ballot committee. And it was quite a stark difference depending on where you looked. So I'm going to throw up right now. This is when you looked at the conversation about the longest ballot committee on X first. So here it is. It is undoubtedly overwhelmingly negative, and the big key word is scam. So there's no question that people on X see the longest ballot committee not as a force for democratic good, but as a way to scam and manipulate elections.
All red all the time.
All red all the time. Okay, but that is not actually the case when you look in other places. So let's look at what they're saying on Reddit. So Reddit, you have left wing, you have right wing.
A lot of commentary in all those subreddits, and it's really interesting because it can be as local as you want.
Now, this is, let's say 2/3 positive. That's AI analysis. But the top keyword that's popping is good. So scam on X, good on Reddit.
Isn't that interesting?
Very interesting. So again, if depending on where you're looking for your information, you may think the longest ballot committee is the worst thing in the world, or you may think that there is some benefits and positives to what they're trying to achieve.
Dare I say there's a bit of an echo chamber, particularly on Twitter, because it's just one single color there?
Quite possibly. That's the longest ballot committee. So now the other headwind Poilievre is facing is obviously this independent who came out of nowhere, Bonnie Critchley. What are your thoughts about Bonnie so far?
So we did a data poll to get some of the data on who is mentioned most often. And that, if you'll remember, was our number of the day at the start of the episode.
Le chiffre de la semaine.
Le chiffre de la semaine. And we're going to throw on the screen here a chart that shows that in over time. And I find this chart very interesting. 1 in 4 is actually a very strong showing, I think, for Bonnie Critchley, simply because Poilievre has many more opportunities to be in the news, right? He's still opposition leader. He's been making a lot of noise regarding Carney and the government. He's also started his own podcast. So, and obviously he has the power of the Conservative Party machinery. But despite that overwhelming effort, he's only getting, about 80% of the mentions versus Bonnie. And a lot of those mentions are not going to be about the by-election. It's about some of these other topics.
We've tracked Darcy Spady as well. Darcy Spady is the Liberal candidate in the riding, barely showing up at all. So really, it's Bonnie who has captured the imagination of local candidates, but the nation as well. I mean, she's such an opposite to Poilievre in the way that she's running her campaign. It comes through as very authentic, I would say. And people like that. She's obviously local to the riding, been there a long time. But, I mean, she is definitely changing the narrative, not such a cakewalk for him.
That's true. And we looked at where she's present. She's got a very strong presence on TikTok. We could see some of her posts were getting easily into the thousands of likes and shares. And you can see for those that don't see the screen, we can see a slow and steady growth in her exposure. So she's doing the beat and she's being regular at it. And I'll just mention that this was one of the criticisms of Pierre Poilievre when he lost his seat in Ottawa-Carleton, is that his opponent was a tireless door knocker, and he spent 2 years knocking on everybody's door multiple times and being extremely present at a local level. And I think this speaks of two different conversations that exist, and in this case are overlapping. So we've got the big national conversation where we're talking about the future leader of the Conservative Party and whether or not he can make it back. And then there's a local story that's specific to all the voters, the residents of Battle River-Crowfoot. And that's the one that's going to drive the results of this election, not the national one.
Exactly. So we do have some insight into what is being said on the ground, but let's just quickly look at the terms and narratives that are being discussed. We looked at Darcy Spady as the Liberal candidate. We looked at Poilievre and we looked at Bonnie. So the big term, Darcy Spady very mentioned the top term saying he's just not going to win. So we can set him aside as a essentially non-entity. What interested me was with Poilievre in the context of Battle River, the top term for him is lose. If I was his team, I'd be very concerned about that brand association. Because they're saying, well, he lost in Carleton, he lost the federal election. The idea of a loser is sticking. It's a bit sticky to him. And you put that in contrast, for those who are listening, you can't see, the top term for Bonnie Critchley is beat Poilievre, proud Albertan.
Like you say, it's his battle to lose. And I think there's also different degrees of winning and losing. So he could still win the seat, but if he does so to a lesser degree than the person he's replacing, and to remind everybody, this is the safest seat in Canada. The ratio, I believe, was 83% of the votes went to the Conservative Party. So what happens if he wins, but it's only 70, 60, 50% of the vote? Does that build a picture of a strong leader? So this is going to be, I'm sure, on everybody's mind. And certainly a lot of the podcasts that cover the strategy and the numbers in politics, for example, the curse of politics is looking at this very closely to see what's the implication in terms of party leadership.
Exactly. So this is more than just him getting his seat. It is how handedly is he getting this seat. Now, as always, whenever looking at this kind of data, we always have to take a bit of a grain of salt. So I am going to sprinkle the salt on the data that we just showed all of you, especially in that last view where we were saying how this idea of this term loser is sticking to Poilievre. That is not necessarily organic. I did look to see those accounts that had the highest volume talking about this by-election, because to me it says these people are trying to shape the narrative. They are aggressively trying to get you to see what they want you to see, right? So they're trying to flood the accounts and flood your feed. Now, which was a bit unusual. Normally, when we look at the top posting accounts, let me know if I'm wrong here, Emmanuel, but they tend to be more right wing, I find, when we see those high volume accounts. In this case, I would say the top 4 or 5 were absolutely pushing an anti Poilievre narrative and pro Bonnie Critchley. And I'm talking between 400 and 500 posts just in a 1 month period. So that's about, 15 to 20 posts a day, primarily retweets, could be bots, probably some are, but there are forces at work here trying to make you think that Poilievre is a loser.
That could very well be. There's definitely some odd data in here, but I think this goes both sides of the issue. To come back to your statement on, is there a lean to Twitter? Some of our research has shown that if we take the more influential accounts in Canada, probably somewhere around 80 to 90% have right-leaning tendencies out of that top 20, and only 10, 15, 20% maybe have left-leaning tendencies. And I did a bit of a lookup in terms of who's mentioning Battle River. And I think this kind of shows the difference in influence, even though in that list of the top tier of Canadian political influencers, there was a lot more posts, probably by a factor of 2 or 3, about Bonnie Critchley. The actual audience reach, so the number of followers of the accounts that were right-leaning and mention Battle River, were actually reaching 10 times more followers.
So what is the implication of that?
Well, the implication is for sure, depending on which channel that you're looking at, we're in a world of echo chambers. The message is reaching the audience, and if you're looking at Twitter, that audience tends to be right-leaning.
So let's look at a different channel, because me, love my TikTok. So YouTube, Jasmine Lane, she was talking about Poilievre generally, not necessarily Battle River-Crowfoot that I could tell. But there was also a TikTok account, Berta Proud Dad. He's local to the riding, and he's gotten second largest engagement on Battle River, so much so that he even did a post yesterday that Pierre Poilievre called him personally to thank him for his support. Now, just his narrative, as he's saying, and we're seeing this on the right-wing TikTok space, is that Bonnie Critchley, while she's running as an independent, they don't believe she's independent. They believe she is backed by left-leaning and progressive groups, that she is almost like an undercover liberal. And there has been suggestions that as soon as if she wins, that she would cross the floor immediately to become a liberal. So they are trying to position her to say, yes, she's local. She says she's independent, but a vote for her is going to be a vote for a left or liberal representative. So narratives trying to challenge each other in different spaces, but it's just interesting. The volume on the left and the engagement is on the right.
I would argue that in Canada, in particular, a lot of social media has, over the years, the right leaning conservative groups have been stronger, have been earlier in entering these channels and have been stronger over time. But the data that we've been collecting since the end of the Canadian election just a few months ago is kind of showing us a pattern that's repeating across YouTube and podcasts and perhaps TikTok, not so much on Twitter, that the left-leaning channels are growing at a faster pace, but they're still behind these very established right-leaning channel. So there's a big shift that's happening in social media in Canada.
All right, well, let's move to our so what section that we have. So, Emmanuel, what's your so what from all of this data that we're seeing? Do you think is Polymarket going to win?
You know, if I was a betted man, I would probably lean towards Polymarket winning, but I think it's going to be a harder or a taller hill to climb than they expected, and there certainly could be surprises. And this is definitely a David and Goliath issue, so we might see some surprising results that are in between that could be problematic for Pierre, even if he wins the election.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that Bonnie is running a very authentic and local campaign. So she has recently opened a TikTok account. It's imagery of her with her horse and her cowboy hat, walking in her field, talking about how she's local to the riding and worked in the armed forces. So it is in very high contrast to a Poilievre who is running around the country, is not in the riding very much. He did go to a stampede recently, so at least he was in the province, but he is much more focused on being part of that national conversation, which as the leader of the Conservative Party makes sense. So my so out of this is Poilievre right now needs to get out of his basement in Stormaway where he's running podcasts, and he needs to spend some time in the riding. We all know that one of his big reasons why he lost the federal election is that he's unlikable. A lot of people just don't like him. So this would have been his opportunity to go door to door, shake some hands, kiss some babies, old school politicking for a couple of weeks, show that human personal side, because that's where he's losing in relative to Bonnie Critchley, is that humanity. And that is his gap in terms of likability, in terms of winning the prime minister seat, which is ultimately what he wants. And we've talked already that if he doesn't do well in this by-election, that could have very big impacts on whether or not he survives a leadership review.
Do you think, Laurel, that what's happening in the U.S. right now with the conservative movement, there's a big change in how Trump is being perceived? We're in the middle of the Epstein crisis, but just overall, a lot of complaints about how different issues, like even pocketbook issues like inflation and cost of living and how immigration has been handled. Anyway, I would argue that there's some challenges for the right-leaning conservative brand that are happening right now. Is there any impact in Canada in terms of structurally a perception around a sort of more conservative approach that could play out in this by-election?
I don't think in this particular by-election, because the nature of the riding that we're in.
So it's a very local.
I mean, it sounds like it's just a values-wise, I don't think there's going to be impact. If it was in a riding that was more diverse in their political views, then potentially. And I don't think that's the issue here. To your point overall, I think it's too early to say whether or not the Canadian conservative movement is going to be impacted by what Trump is dealing with, the Epstein files and the backtracking that he has done. That issue is particularly unique to Trump himself as an individual and his actions as an individual before he was ever president. I think people are actually quite supportive of a lot of his policies. So in terms of how he deals with immigration, how he's dealing with government spending, cuts that they're making to Medicare, shutting down US aid and NPR. I think he still has a lot of support amongst conservatives for taking those actions. The only challenge, I think, is the whole tariffs side of things. Even Canadian conservatives have issue with him targeting Canada with tariffs, but I think ideologically they love what he's doing, particularly on the immigration front. I think that actually is a topic. It's going to be a tough topic, but maybe one we should look at is immigration, because that is all over my feeds, all over the news. People are talking about in a big way.
And it's turning underwater for him, definitely in the U.S. Probably not with the right-leaning folks, but definitely with the independents and the left-leaning, but overall negative now. With that, I'm hearing our tree choppers getting here.
So it's time for us to get off.
Time for us to go and watch that tree sadly come down.
I know, I'm so sad. All right, everyone, thank you for joining us. Thank you, as always, Emmanuel, and we will see you all next time.
Until next time.